My name is Patrice Petro. I'm here with Professor Nick Baer from UC Berkeley, and we're here to discuss Murnau's classic 1927 film Sunrise as part of our larger series on panic. So let me begin with our very special guest. You've written recently about the films, Murnau's films, and I think you attended a symposium on Murnau. So could you tell us more about this important figure and director in the history of silent film, and what scholars are saying now? You know, as I said at the beginning, he directed 17 films in Germany and 4 in America, yet most of the German films are lost. So I'm wondering just if you could tell the audience a little bit more about Murnau from recent work.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks also for inviting me to join you for the discussion. I should say your own work on Weimar cinema has been super foundational for me and so many, so it's a real privilege for me to be here. Certainly Murnau, as you mentioned before the screening, is one of the most celebrated directors of the silent era, and alongside Fritz Lang, certainly the most famous director of Weimar cinema, apart from Sunrise, which you just watched, known for films such as Nosferatu, a new remake of which will appear this winter actually, and The Last Laugh, Faust, and Taboo. And scholars have often kind of characterized him as a visionary innovator, a lyrical film artist, and a romantic melancholic. And I think it's also worth looking back at Lotte Eisner's 1964 book on Murnau, also where she interviewed many of the people who collaborated with him in the 1920s. And what kind of emerges from that book is that Murnau was very demanding, meticulous, and unflagging in his work, whether in Germany, the US, or the Pacific Islands. He would oftentimes do hundreds of takes of a single visual effect until he got it just right. And so Murnau directed films both in Germany and later in the US that were celebrated for their aesthetic and technical innovations, the Unchained Camera, one among many others. But he was also known for frequent excesses in budget and in production schedule as well, and he constantly was coming up against the constraints of the studio system and gained a reputation as being difficult. And even his final partnership with Robert Flaherty was unsuccessful, so he wound up self-financing his final film, Taboo. And so I'm interested in him as a kind of perfectionist director as well.
Yeah, of course, because you're working on questions of perfection in film and film theory. Given that this, to take another key word, given that this is one of the first films we're featuring in our series on panic, I wondered how you would talk about how panic is figured in this film narratively and aesthetically.
Yeah, it's very interesting that this is part of the Panic series, and I was thinking about the question of panic as I rewatched the film today. I mean, certainly heterosexuality in the film involves a near constant state of panic, and it's a film very much about masculinity in crisis, where men are often displacing their ambivalence, even their murderous impulses, onto women, what we would now call a kind of toxic masculinity, where Charles O'Brien's character is kind of pendulating between this possessive jealousy and then this desire towards murder, with violence always being this common denominator. But in terms of the kind of aesthetic and narrative features of Panic, certainly the film is drawing from German Expressionism. Murnau is finding a kind of visual language for subjective states, really delving into the subjectivity of his characters. So we get allegorical figures without names, so man, wife, woman from the city. We get the kind of dislocation of the narrative from specific spatial and temporal coordinates. So at the beginning, this intertitle says it could take place anywhere, anytime. And the acting also shows us, through facial expressions, posture, and body language, a kind of strong sense of characters' inner states. And even the intertitles have an expressive function. So you remember the intertitle where it says, "Couldn't she get drowned?" And the words themselves seem to kind of drown in water. But when we were just talking backstage, as much as the film is about panic, and this is something that's come out in more recent scholarship to your first question, people have pointed out, like Michel Wedel, that the comic also plays a big role in Murnau. So the long sequence here with the pig chase, and the pig then getting drunk off of wine, or even that extended gag where the straps from the woman's dress keep falling off, this kind of gag that she's too immersed in the spectacle to notice her own clothing. So the comic also plays an interesting role here in kind of coordination with the sense of panic as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, just reflect on the title of the film, a subtitle, I should say, A Tale of Two, or a song, not a tale, a song, which is important, of two humans. And it explores, the primacy of the monogamous couple, the preservation of traditional values, the rural way of life as opposed to the corruption of the city, but of course the city is also a space of redemption. One of the things I was thinking about with, I was thinking, there's this, a PhD student in the audience, Marcel Strobel, who's working on a dissertation on Weimar, an interwar German film. And he's taking a look at the 1919 film considered to be the first maybe gay film, Anders als die anderen. And he's done this analysis of the film where he reflects on the title to say that Anders als die anderen is not, people have thought for a long time it means, you know, different from the others, like gay people are different from straight, but on closer analysis of the film and discourses of the period, it's like there's the good gay person, good gay man, and the sexual pervert that has to be shunned. And so that Anders als die anderen is differences among gay men. So I was thinking with this as a song of two humans, if the human is really, the male is George O'Brien, and he has two sides. We see both his loving, childish, playful side, but also his murderous, and this lumbering body, which I was saying is so much, reminds me of like Emily Yanning's in The Last Laugh, where it's always framed with this, you know, this back, and he kind of lumbers over her. Now, I know we're going to talk about this, but just as a preview of coming attractions, Nick will talk about kind of beefcake photography of George O'Brien. But here, you know, the clothing doesn't really give that away. But anyways, your thoughts?
Yeah, a lot there, and definitely we want to talk about the kind of queer dimensions of Murnau and of this film as well. And the film is definitely shaped, as you mentioned, by these oppositions between man and woman, city and country, lightness and darkness, etc. And you know, scholars have argued more generally that Murnau's films are split. On the one hand, this romantic longing for nature, innocence, a simple life, a kind of Arcadian ideal. On the other hand, an acknowledgement that there's no return to these ideals, that there's a kind of paradise lost as we fall into the modern age. And what strikes me, though, is that there's a real dialectic at play, I think, in this film, and that plays out on a number of levels. So obviously between pastoralism and urban modernity, natural landscapes and studio sets, a kind of indebtedness to traditional arts, but also the cultivation of a specifically filmic aesthetics. And indeed, as you noted, the song of Two Humans suggests already a kind of musical analogy as well, just like Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. And then there's a kind of romantic sensibility, but also cutting-edge technology, and this is a movie that's using Fox Movietone sound on film system for its music and sonic effects. And I think all sorts of examples we could find of this dialectic are at play. But one scene that I always love in this film is the scene where they go to the portrait studio to get their picture taken. And it's this kind of photographic technology that produces and preserves this moment of bucolic bliss. And so it's this really highly reflexive sequence in the film that's charting and staging the various stages of image production, with also an emphasis on the equipment and the technicians involved. And this pastoral image that emerges becomes what Walter Benjamin might have called the kind of blue flower in the land of technology, where the equipment-free natural reality is actually the kind of height of artifice there as well. So I'm always interested in the dialectics between these seeming oppositions in Murnau's work.
Yeah. Well, could you say a little bit more of how one might consider this a work of a queer filmmaker?
Definitely. So George O'Brien, as you said, this kind of muscular, hulky figure, known for westerns with John Ford, like The Iron Horse from 1924, later also action and adventure roles. You know, one thing that really opened my own eyes to the queer dimensions of this was about a decade ago at the Schwules Museum, the Gay Museum in Berlin. They did an exhibition of Murnau's private photographs and then subsequently published as an exhibition catalog that you can buy online. And there you see, indeed, as you mentioned, some of Murnau's kind of beefcake photos of George O'Brien in skimpy swimwear on Murnau's yacht or on the beach. And it was clear that Murnau had a kind of homoerotic interest in George O'Brien. And watching the film, one feels that George O'Brien is much more the site of erotic fascination than...
For everybody.
Yes, for everyone. Certainly more than Janet Gaynor. And this becomes all the more explicit in a later Murnau film, City Girl, where the male protagonist, who's also a farmer from the country, enters the city and is totally objectified by the female gaze at this diner. And so I think it's an interesting case of pushing back against some of the more classical feminist film theories of the male gaze. Here we do get a male gaze, but it's also a queer gaze on the male protagonist.
Yeah, yeah. Well, just to shift things just slightly, but within the same register, One film historian has argued that Murnau's Sunrise was a film made for a U.S. audience and within the context of a different set of formal and narrative conventions relating to sexuality, the representation of sexual identity, and modes of abstraction, which do not carry over, she argued, from one national cinema, Germany, to the U.S. So, do you agree with this assessment? I mean, this was Murnau's first American film. He had a lot of latitude in making the film. He picked Janet Gaynor himself. But this person is saying it breaks with what were the emerging conventions at the time of Hollywood cinema.
Definitely. So yeah, after the international success of The Last Laugh that you mentioned from 1924, Murnau was hired to work in Hollywood. William Fox billed him in the US as the German genius, as kind of a marketing strategy. And as you said, Murnau enjoyed tremendous liberty in making Sunrise, given kind of carte blanche in terms of time and also expense, and certainly later on he wasn't afforded the same liberties in the subsequent films that he made in Hollywood. And for Sunrise, it's worth mentioning just in terms of the crew that he brought some of his previous collaborators on board. So the screenplay is by Karl Mayer, who is known for the so-called Kammerspiel films, so the chamber play film, and Mayer had written the screenplay for The Last Laugh. And the art director who did the sets was Rokas Glisa, who had worked on prior Murnau films like The Burning Soil and The Grand Duke's Finances. We notice here this enormous kind of set constructed for the city street and the exterior shooting then at Lake Arrowhead. Obviously, one of the things that's totally remarkable about this film is the use of the moving camera, these extraordinary tracking shots. And so the cinematography by Charles Rocher and Karl Strauss, who won, of course, then the first Oscar for Best Cinematography in 1929. Murnau certainly, I think, was a bit of a misfit in the Hollywood system, and he's coming from Weimar, Germany, which allowed, I think, for greater ambiguity without this very streamlined narrative economy. So there's less focus here on kind of narrative cause and effect, greater emphasis on atmosphere, on mood, emotional states of the characters, and we get this through a lot of formal and stylistic devices, so the shot compositions, the depth staging, the superimpositions and dissolves, the play with light and shadow, and as I said, the extraordinary camera movements at various points in the film that are really breathtaking to behold, for sure.
This time, when we were constructing this script together, sending it back and forth, and you made sure to make sure that you say it's not just narrative, but sonic elements.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could say something about how you saw, like the role of the clock, or different kinds of sounds that emerge and like wake up the characters or turn things in a different direction. If you could say a little bit about the sound.
Yeah, so this is a film that's using the Fox Movietone sound on film system, and this is a film that's also coming out the same year, so 1927, the same year as The Jazz Singer. So a period when there's the kind of introduction of synchronized sound into Hollywood cinema. And, in terms of recent scholarship that you're mentioning as well, Julian Hanisch has written about how Murnau finds all sorts of kind of formal and stylistic devices to visualize sound on film. And so, towards the beginning of the film, when the woman from the city whistles to him, and we can almost hear the whistle in this almost synesthetic manner through ways in which Murnau is kind of giving us the sound without actually having us hear it. But then certainly there are actual sounds in the film, and in addition to the music, and also the juxtaposition of multiple layers of acoustics as well is quite remarkable, I think.
Yeah. So, as you said, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences awards were first given in 1929, and that very first year, Sunrise won a special award that has never been given again for, quote, artistic quality of production. And Janet Gaynor won the first Oscar for Best Actress for her work in Sunrise, Seventh Heaven, and Street Angel. And yet, her presence in Sunrise, there's something I kept thinking, why not George O'Brien? Why Janet Gaynor winning, no, seriously, winning the Best Actress? I mean, I think there are moments where her facial features and her eyes and her gestures, I mean, it's really, very well done. But there's also, and I can't remember who wrote about it, you told me, I think you might remember, like just her hair. I mean, I realize that when she's in the beauty salon, she doesn't want anybody touching her traditional look. She's got a style, you know. But there's something odd about her presence in the film. You know, there's something about the wig itself seems so unnatural. I don't know. What are your thoughts about these first Academy Awards? We could do Emiliani's too, you know, obviously.
Oh, that's right. No, it's interesting to hear your comments on that in terms of the figuration of women in the film, because definitely it's a film that has very bifurcated gender roles, and where women are either in the domestic sphere or the erotic sphere. They're either good mothers or vamps, sources of kind of procreation or pleasure, and then, as you said, though, despite this very patriarchal, misogynistic gender economy in the film, Murnau is known for non-normative figurations of gender and sexual identity, so there is a way, and I think you're referring to maybe the work of Janet Bergstrom earlier, who has this classic essay from, 86 on sexuality at a loss, where she's thinking about how Murnau's films actually defy characterizations of classical Hollywood, where normally, in Laura Mulvey's terms, the men are active bearers of the gaze and the women are there to be looked at as kind of passive objects. Here, something quite different is happening, I think, where the women characters are totally flat and not sources of erotic fascination, and the bodies, as you said, kind of become abstractions and not the site of erotic interest or point of focus for the director. So it does defy our usual sense of classical Hollywood and its gender economy in interesting ways, I think, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Bergstrom argues also is that sexuality is displaced from the female body, where onto setting, atmosphere. She never talks about it being displaced to the male character, but she often talks about male characters in Murnau's films as being feminized, often in positions where they are prone or in traditional. And I was thinking of it here again, although the framing him from behind and his back and his looming over her, even, she becomes, in some, she's very small. Yeah. In others that, he's much, sometimes he diminishes a little bit, depends on the shot. But I wondered, she's saying that it goes, that that all the characters are one-dimensional and allegorical, but that sexuality is displaced from the female body and usually onto men. And she's thinking like in Nosferatu. And,
oh yes, yeah.
Yeah, and
very bisexual.
And the draping, and the collapsing onto the fainting couch, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, do you see you're saying to me that you think that the George O'Brien character is being eroticized in ways that's different. How about compared to the city woman, who of course is like Faust? I mean, she's in the shiny black outfit, and even the reverie on the water about what the promises of female sexuality in the city might bring. Absolutely,
and as you're saying, there's a way in which they're coded very differently in terms of their costumes, light versus dark, daytime versus nighttime, etc. And I guess when I was watching it just now, again, one thing I was thinking about is the role of animals actually in the film, and how there is something almost bird-like about Janet Gaynor, also in how slight she is, and then also the scene when they're going on the rowboat and then the dog comes and then she kind of escapes almost like an animal that's about to be trapped, and so and then you get the pig later. So there's something also about animal kind of imagery in the film and how she's part of that as well that I found striking, that I would want to think further about as well.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. So yeah, you kind of, I was going to ask you about the differences between the women, where the city woman is in black, she's a brunette, her clothing shines like a snake skin. The peasant woman is pale and blonde and dresses in light, soft tones. The territory of the bad woman, which I love, this is swamps and rivers.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas she acts by moonlight, whereas the good woman acts in sunlight and farmland and domestic animals and flowers and babies and, I mean, I think we get the point. So clearly both the city woman and the wife are one-dimensional types, but I wonder, in the story of redemption that's told, it's the city that enables them to come back together. Yeah. And it starts in the church. It starts with this kind of remarriage.
Yes.
That, watching it today, I was thinking how they enter this church, they see the bride in her veil entering this church, and they go in the back, No one notices them there. But this is where he really does break down. This becomes the final, once he sees that he has broken his vow to love and protect her. So that's the moment of transformation.
Yes.
That then later gets memorialized with the photograph. But yeah, there seems to be, as I said, the conundrum of the film for me has often been, it trades in these kind of moral absolutes and these kind of oppositions. But then, and they remain, but they're also questioned, but on an aesthetic plane rather than in terms of narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Definitely the scene where they go back to when they go to the church, they see this marriage happening. He hears the vows about protecting your wife, and then he breaks down and shows a very different, going back to your point about the two humans being maybe two sides of his own personality.
Right.
This other side of him comes out. He breaks into tears for the first time, and then as they exit the church, it looks like they've just gotten married in this kind of procession, and that is kind of, as you said, a clear turning point in the film, leading to a very different kind of emotional register than we've had previously.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember thinking about how I saw sunrise here at UCSB as an undergraduate in the 70s. I know I saw it here, but I remember seeing it at the University of Iowa in the early 80s. And then it was this hope that there was, and maybe this was Dudley Andrews' particular sensibility, that it was about a kind of spiritualism in film, that this moment, the redemption of the George O'Brien character, where he redeems himself and has to play out this kind of moral drama. You were telling me in the green room that Marianne Doan wrote one of her first essays on sunrise.
Yes.
You want to say a little bit about that?
Yes.
I just think this is fat. Only people like me think this is fat.
I think her first publication ever was on sunrise, and you can find it online. And she actually integrates Deleuze and talks about jealousy as kind of operative affect in the film. And it comes out really clearly in the scene at the barber shop, where they're both kind of mutually jealous of other people flirting on their partners. And she talks about, kind of in a Deleuzian framework, quite early actually to be using Deleuze, that the jealousy always involves a desire to foreclose the possibilities of the other. So the way in which that plays out kind of mutually in that scene is really fascinating, where the wife gets jealous about the woman offering the manicure, and then he gets very territorial about the man who's kind of aggressively hitting on his wife. And so jealousy is a kind of running motif that comes out especially strongly in that scene.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I wanted to just ask you a little bit if you to reflect on how Murnau's films often center on travel, transition, and transgression. In other words, whether he's filming in Slovakia or on the shores of the Baltic in Nosferatu, or a German village built at the Fox Studios in Sunrise, or Tahiti for Taboo. What do you make of the location settings? You mentioned a little bit at the beginning about, when we were speaking about this, I was telling Nick that when I teach Nosferatu, I always talk about how it is all this exploration about how unnatural nature is. In lots of, so there's exploring these a kind of queer nature that is, but it's actually, this is nature. So I wonder here with the location settings, what role they play here, even if it's, the German village.
Yeah, I was struck by that watching this again now, because the opening intertitle of the film is, "Wherever the sun rises and sets, in the city's turmoil or under the open sky on the farm, life is much the same, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet." So it's actually collapsing the difference in a way between city and country as both places involving both kind of sweet and bitter moments in life. And then the film is actually marked by these chiasmic tourist routes, right? Because the first intertitle is on summertime vacation time, and then this train is presumably leading the woman from the city to go to the country, where she then overstays her welcome. And then it's the rural couple that visits the city, where they then rekindle their love, and then keep getting marked in the city as country bumpkins as well. And then of course at the end of the film, the rural couple goes back to the country and the city woman goes back to the city, so they kind of complete their respective routes. But it doesn't seem to me that the film privileges country over city in any simple or facile way. Certainly the film is characterized by a lot of ambivalence, where there's a marked fascination by the spectacles and attractions of the city. And, it's the Industrial Revolution itself, that is leading to this kind of glorification of nature as a site of consoling refuge. So only when nature is called into question or seems to be under threat do people then start to romanticize it retrospectively. And so there's a way in which I think the film knows in a kind of reflexive way that its very idyllic image of nature is one that actually only can kind of come in the wake of industrialization and urbanization as well.
Well, of course, as a city woman, as you said, her travel, she's the tourist, and tourists come to this little village to experience the little village, and the villagers need the tourists, right? Because, farm, when she circles the ad, looking to sell your farm and move to the city. So you already this space it is totally connected to the city, and it's taking people from the city who then become lodgers in these little places where they are scraping to get by. So there's the city is in the country, and the country is in the city.
Absolutely,
and even with the pig thing. And of course, the great thing is that the George O'Brien character could be a hero because he could wrestle a pig.
Yes.
And not a lot of city people can wrestle a pig.
But then in that moment where he first resists being marked as the country bumpkin, he thinks that he's going to get to dance to maybe a waltz, and then instead they play the peasant dance. But yeah, this theme of the financial difficulties of farmers actually runs through a lot of Murnau's films. So The Burning Soil from 1922, and then later City Girl also are about kind of farmers having financial difficulties. And what's interesting is that it's not as if the countryside is pure bliss and the city is threatening. The countryside can also be very oppressive, and I think in City Girl you get this very abusive father-in-law figure on the country, and it's a film that I think in really interesting ways prefigures Jane Campion's more recent work on The Power of the Dog in that regard. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, here's my last question for you before we open up to all of you. So can you tell us a little bit about Murnau after Sunrise?
Yeah.
And in your recent work, you've speculated that his films address broader questions about the status of speculation, uncertain or contested knowledge. Can you tell us more about that?
Definitely. One thing that I've written about myself is rumors and gossip as a kind of recurring concern of Murnau's films. Most explicitly, for those of you who have seen The Last Laugh, there's a sequence when the women in this back courtyard spread word of the Hotel Doorman's demotion from doorman to then bathroom attendant. And even in Sunrise, towards the beginning of the film, it's the women of the country town who are gossiping about the state of the marriage, actually providing us with really crucial narrative information that also gives us occasion for these brief flashbacks as well. So gossip serves a kind of crucial narrative function, you could say, in Murnau's film. Certainly they're reproducing very gendered figurations of gossip as, a very frivolous, even sometimes malicious activity. Women are usually the ones depicted as idle chatterers. But what's interesting, I think, and notable about Murnau's films, also when we compare them to maybe Fritz Lang, is that the unverified information that we get is oftentimes actually true. Unlike in M, where there's this mass panic, and the theme of panic created by this kind of telephone game of who's the murderer of the city.
Or again in Fury, which produces... Of course, it's the women who are compared to chickens, who are gossips, and it's the game of telephone, and they get everything absolutely wrong,
leading to
and
this
leads
lynch
to the
mob.
panic. Now, we would have done Fury in the Panic series, but we already did Fury,
And it's interesting, I think, in relation to Murnau's own biography. So Murnau was known to be very reserved, secretive, and discreet, and his own homosexuality was a matter of kind of unverified speculation, and traces of his queerness have been very elusive. His brother and later the keeper of his estate, Robert Plumpe, really suppressed and denied traces of Murnau's own homosexuality. And as you mentioned at the beginning, he died in a freak car accident actually here in Santa Barbara, and died at the Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital, which I guess still exists. Kenneth Anger, the queer avant-garde filmmaker who just passed away recently, in his famous book Hollywood Babylon, this work of kind of queer historiography, included very sordid kind of insinuations about the circumstances of Murnau's death, alleging not only homosexuality but also pederasty, then various commentators have sought to kind of disprove some of the rumors that anger was spreading in that book. So it plays out also on a kind of meta level in Murnau's biography in interesting ways. But what I find interesting is nowadays when we think about unverified information, we think about the crises of fake news and misinformation on social media. But I think what these films also give us, more dialectically again, is a sense that rumors and gossip can also really be a crucial tool of resistance and the spread of information, especially for marginalized or oppressed people. And here we can think about the role of rumors or gossip, let's say, in relation to Me Too, these kind of women's whisper networks that spread information about which men in Hollywood to avoid. Or even if we think about queer history, where the queerness of particular figures is often elided or unverified in official accounts. And so the queerness of Hollywood history or history more generally often remains speculative, unstable, and ambiguous. And I think what's interesting is that Murnau's films themselves often adopt this very fluid kind of queer epistemology and accord rumors oftentimes a kind of truth value as well. So
yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but it's true, because in Fritz Lang, the rumor mill that's the source of the death of our everyman.
Yes, Spencer Tracy.
So it isn't about giving information that actually could be useful or truthful. And yeah, that's interesting. Anyways, we're ready now to open up to audience questions. I'm going to turn things over to the ever-capable Emily Zinn, who will give you directions.
My question was, had anybody interviewed Mr. Stevenson, the valet?
Yes, so that's a really interesting question. So about the circumstances of Murnau's death. So Kenneth Anger, I guess to go into a bit more detail, argues in Hollywood Babylon that there was a, I think 13-year-old, if I remember, 14-year-olds, okay, thank you.
Make a big difference.
Hired an underage Filipino driver, servant, and that there was oral sex being performed, and that led him to veer off the road, basically, because he was distracted. And more recently, Les Hammer has done very kind of precise archival research and reconstructed exactly the circumstances and found out that it wasn't, in fact, an underage Filipino man, but in fact, I think a Mexican man around closer to 30 years old, who was in fact the driver. So has tried to kind of disprove some of Anger's allegations from Hollywood Babylon. Marklyn Anderson, a film historian at University of Pittsburgh, has written a really excellent essay for Nexus called Anger Management, about why people have been so obsessed with correcting the record of Anger's Hollywood Babylon, and saying that, even, first of all, there are things that are irreducibly ambiguous about the exact circumstances of Murnau's death, but why is it that there's this desire to kind of restore a sense of virtue to Murnau and to kind of restore his tarnished reputation? And so has argued that there is a value in queer history to leaving things ambiguous in a way, and so has questioned our desire to kind of get the facts straight and whether this positive impulse even makes sense when we talk about a queer figure like Murnau.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you. Hi. Something I was thinking about with like this distinction with pastoral life and city life is climate and how that kind of collapses the difference between the two with weather. And I was also thinking about the role of electricity in expressing that collapse with lightning, and then of course the electricity of like this Coney Island-esque scene. I'm just wondering, is this like something he was very cognizant of, thinking about climate in relation to how it's kind of cutting across these differences? Yeah, just general question.
No, it's a really interesting question. Do you have anything to? No? I think certainly people have written about, Lotte Eisner among them actually, about so Stimmung is the German word for mood or atmosphere, and what a strong role that plays in the kind of mise en scène of Murnau's films. And certainly there's a lot about the use of lighting, artificial lighting, and the play with light and shadow in his works. But I think it's really interesting also from a contemporary perspective, as you're saying, when we think about climate and the natural disaster towards the end of the film that actually, ironically, does threaten the wife with death, which was the husband's original wish, that then comes back ironically to kind of haunt him. And thinking today, when we are seeing natural disasters unfold around us, like the hurricanes in Florida recently, that this gains a new kind of valence through the lens of the Anthropocene. So I think that's a great impulse with which to reread the film. Yeah.
I like to find out if somebody has written anything from the point of view of the wife. Every time I've seen this film, and the last few times I've seen it on video, and this time I made a point of seeing it from the point of view of the wife, right? I mean, because I just chose a different character to look at. And it seems to me that is the perfect way to create a point of view that is not only the woman and her desire, because one of the questions I've always had about this film, why does she forgive him? I mean, he just tried to kill her. It's not, it's not just a passing thought.
There's that cute baby.
Huh?
There's the cute baby.
Well, but that's exactly the point. She has something that she has neglected as well, which is she has chosen the baby, in other words, right?
Oh,
I
that
mean,
old chestnut.
The old idea, right?
Okay,
But
but I hear you.
But the point is that it makes the perfect point of view. Not only is it a queer point of view, but it's also from the point of view of the sexuality of the woman. And now I just looking at her, I see her touching him, I see her grooming him, turning him again into something that she can desire, into something that goes beyond the baby, in other words, right? Because so far we are just seeing her pensively, just defeatedly preparing food. That's it, right? And the baby, which is the only enthusiasm that we see her display. And then when he proposes the trip, there are, I understand the Academy Award, there are 15 emotions that you see on her face, right? It's happiness, it's doubt, is maybe, maybe not. And then when they finally go, you can see she's rebuilding the relationship. She's rebuilding him into an object of desire. And she, and then of course, I mean, that's the payoff to some extent. Has anybody ever thought about writing from the point of view of Murnau's women? Because it's actually quite interesting.
Well, I think, for instance, I asked that question to Werner Herzog because I thought he was rewriting Murnau's women in his version of Nosferatu.
And we remember that.
Oh, he took offense. I mean, no, I think what you're saying is interesting. Is what I thought today, and I hear what you're saying, and we know these are tropes in lots of films where the the woman remakes the man in the image. It's more in romantic comedy, but here it's those early scenes when they were, as we learned from the Gossip Mill, that they were happy like children. So, and when they say that in those scenes, it's with the baby. It's a smaller baby, but the baby. And then there's the, oh, there's that cow or steer. You don't get the horn next to the baby. But their happiness seems to be that the spell is broken. They don't give us enough information, but it's when the city folk come to the rural place and he meets this woman. I mean, because they were happy. When I saw the child in the bed, right, when she's really sad, what you're saying, she comes at the standstill, and it's an older child. So you think, has a year gone by? I mean, from the baby,
yeah, but that's exactly
from the
right.
flashback,
I mean,
yeah.
And then I noticed like three kind of sexual cliches, one after the other, after the pigs situation when they have the dance and it's all very sensuous and so on. And then there is the water fountain, which is way too big for any place, right? I mean, it has lots of water. And then there is the phallic statue, and then there is the fireworks, right? I mean, and you get all this stuff. And I'm going, okay, so we got it, right? I mean, in within 10 seconds, there is an explosion of different, right? So I thought, seeing the entire work of Murnau from that perspective would be great.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. In the last, you don't have that kind of expansiveness maybe in the last laugh around female characters. I'm trying to think of other.
I mean, City Girl, I think.
Yes, Nick is saying that City Girl is the
that's a
interesting
great film.
companion
Yes,
piece.
in terms of also the feminine, the woman's perspective. No, those are great comments, definitely.
And in Taboo, it's not there.
Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. And I think it's actually the God is witnessing the redemption in the church, in his transformation back to the good guy. That's why she believes him. But for you guys, I was thinking not so much about gossip, but the general sense of, the popular obsession with the scandalous, all that stuff, right? So I was also thinking of how just 2 years ago, Theodore Dreiser published the novel, An American Tragedy, that then gets taken up by Sternberg like 4 years later, and then it's remade by George Stevens in the early 50s into A Place in the Sun. And these are all stories about someone about to be getting drowned or actually drowned in a river or a pond or whatever. And there were actually in 1906 or so, and then again the 30s, there were big cases in this country about the wife getting drowned by the husband because there was another woman. So that kind of zeitgeist of around these sort of murders. Has anyone written about the connections between these sort of,
Not that I'm aware of. I like that line of inquiry a lot in terms of looking at cases of wives being drowned here. And I think it brings together some of the previous questions nicely in terms of, I think the motif, this is a recurring motif of Weimar cinema, of course, the man who gets distracted by urban modernity and the wife who's just made dinner, which is usually soup and bread, and then he leaves. This is exactly the plot of Karl Kroener's The Street from 1923, and then he gets seduced by the kind of attractions of the city and then ultimately comes back in a full circle moment. And I think there's a way in which the film, and this goes back to the question about climate, is also drawing on melodramatic topoi as well, with nature exteriorizing in this kind of pathetic fallacy the states of the characters. But one can think of the Griffith film with Lillian Gish with the waterfall.
Way Down East.
Yes, Way Down East as well, in terms of these.
And those are also 19th century images of women in the reeds. And I'm trying to remember the title of the book. Idols of, all about landscapes and what is it
Brim
called?
Dijkstra's?
Yeah.
Idols of...
Yeah.
No,
that
was your
I
book.
stole it, yeah. I wanted to say, but even with Tragedy of the Street, in my own first book, I tried to say, everybody reads it as the poor male characters, longing for excitement from the drab soup and bread, and goes out and meets a hooker, then has to run home to mama and puts his head on her lap. And Krakauer famously said this is a main motif of the Weimar cinema. So when I was writing about it, I said that the film is called Tragedy of the Whore. It's not Tragedy of the Street. And it's Asta Nielsen, for God's sake. And it's her story. It isn't his. And I tried to, like you said, see it as a story told from her point of view, which is about the aging prostitute, the aging star, which is what was with Asta Nielsen. So, yeah, I think there are ways to kind of switch the narrative on this, and it needs to be done. It's just that Janet Gaynor, I don't know, in this film compared to her other films, she's so one-dimensional. Although I hear you, as you said, what her Oscar-winning performance was this. When you said, why does she take him back? Well, I think the church is a very important, where he breaks down totally. Yes. He's saying, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. It's like, okay, yeah, sure. But it's when he prostrates himself.
I think it is, yeah, definitely, as Pascal is saying, a moment of redemption and catharsis as well, where all of the brooding emotions that he's been bottling up and, suddenly are released through this, he breaks into tears.
Right. And I think, too, I tried to counter, I still think this is clever, and I think it's also true, that where the man falls, he regresses and puts his head on the woman's lap as if he was a child regressing. And I said the image I always see is women pounding on doors and trying to get in. No, seriously, you can see it across the cinema, and I talk about it in a lot of these films where it's about closed doors, and so there's other motifs that are going on.
You're already touching on it. My question is about agency and the character's agency versus things that might be forced on them by their environment. I was just wondering if you might comment more on how Murnau portrays his characters as either having agency or maybe not.
That's interesting. Do you have any thoughts on that initially?
Do you? No, because I'm thinking about, how much agency, if we look at the man, how much agency does he have? He has agency, and so does the wife,
Yeah, I'm thinking about the moment actually when he decides not to murder his wife, and actually this maybe links back to Bhaskar's point because it's their church bells that you actually hear in that moment, and which also might be kind of foreshadowing, but the theme, the religious kind of overtones, literally in that moment, but that it's a interesting moment in terms of either you could see it in terms of weakness, like he can't go through with this act that he set out to commit. Or you could see it as, some higher agency, even metaphysical or divine, that's kind of intervening in that moment as well. I think that's a really interesting question to consider.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming to watch sunrise on a Saturday afternoon with us, and stick around for questions. And we have more fun for you coming up all quarter. Please join me in thanking Nick Baer for coming down from Berkeley to join us today.
Thank you so much.